President Trump is going to give him as much time as he thinks it's necessary to create the right situation. And I think one of the things, in addition to the $1 billion in arms that have been sold directly to Ukraine, there's also U.S. is selling about $1 billion a month through our NATO allies that are being provided to Ukraine. And so President Trump's making sure, one, that Ukraine can continue to defend itself, and by giving them some deeper strike capabilities that obviously could help them offensively. They've already taken out about 20% of Russia's oil refining capacity in the last month. And at the same time, he has so many other cards to play.
You know, this sounds a lot like some of the stuff that we were already doing with Joe Biden.
How is any of that different from the Biden administration's strategy?
Well, quite frankly, it's all different. First of all, those weapons, the U.S. weapons that are now being used on the front lines of the war in Ukraine are not being paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we are talking with the Russians. That was not happening during the Biden administration. And finally, we're giving some deeper strike capabilities, and most likely the Ukrainians are going to use them. And that obviously is much different than what Joe Biden did.
Okay, mixed bag here. First of all, he's bragging about how, well, we're not paying for this anymore. So there's no more money of ours going out, and we're selling about $1 billion a month of weapons to Ukraine. Well, first question I ask is, wait a minute, where are those weapons coming from? It's not like we have this defense industrial base that's just cranking stuff out there and they just take it off the showroom floor or out of the warehouses and ship it on off to Ukraine every month and thank you very much for $1 billion coming in. It's not as important who's paying that money. That's a factor, but there's a bigger question of where's it coming from? If you can't produce it, hear me clearly, if you're not producing $1 billion worth of ammunition and weapons per month, then by definition, you're taking it out of your existing stockpiles. And if your capacity is not big enough to meet that demand, that means you're also not backfilling the losses you've already had. Previously, about a month or so ago, the latest evidence or statistics were that it would take the United States, after the war had ended and after the Israeli wars against all of the people they're fighting in the Middle East had ended, it would have taken about 5 years at existing capacity to replace all the things that our stockpiles need to get back up to their proper level. 5 years after the wars have stopped. None of them have stopped. Everything's continuing to go on in the Middle East. We still give Israel stuff. So part of that stockpile is going in that direction. And then now part of the other stockpile, whatever's left of it, is going in the Ukraine direction. And great, you're making $1 billion a month, or at least, in sales. But what good does that money do if you're whittling down further our own stocks? And how far is this going to go anyway? Because what is the strategy here? I get it. You say that you want to pressure Russia into capitulation. You're not going to. And none of the things all through the Biden administration and now here into nearly September of the Trump second term here, none of the things have caused Russia to do anything other than continue to press forward on the air and in the ground on this war. So why do you think that if a $61 billion package in the last year of the Biden administration didn't move the needle, and in fact, Russia continued to advance at a higher rate, ironically, after the passage of that bill, and everything that was done in 22 and 23, if that didn't force Russia into any kind of capitulation, if the sanctions didn't force them into anything, why do you think $1 billion per month is going to do what all the previous years of much higher expenditures failed to do? You see where I'm going with this? It's illogical. It's irrational to think that so if it's one per month, 12 billion in a year of equipment, 12 billion is going to do what 61 billion didn't do. And you're continuing, you have no plan to how you're going to recoup our own losses, how you're going to replace the ammunition and the weapons that we've given away. And how is that going to have any effect that you want on the battlefield to drive Russia back? There's no rational positive answer to that. There is an answer, and it's you're not going to force Russia. You are going to continue to dwindle our stocks. And yay for the defense industrial base companies, I suppose. They'll be making money. It will work for them. There's no doubt about it. The defense industrial capacity, the companies themselves We'll handsome-profitably for this. They got to be just loving it that they're hearing that there's going to be $1 billion of sales per month of American-made stuff. Everybody's going to want to get some of that pie, so they couldn't be happier. But the American people are going to be, our national security is going to be at greater risk because of this. And the Ukrainian people are simply going to continue to die. Because here's the perverse problem with that. That keeps alive the Zelensky and his group, and certainly all those leaders in Europe that we talk about a lot. It's going to keep alive their motivation to keep going, because they wanted to do everything they could to disrupt the peace process, and they have effectively succeeded now. So they have not given in anything. You remember heading into, after the Anchorage meeting between Russia and the United States, and before the Washington meeting, you may recall I showed a soundbite of Ursula von der Leyen from the European Union talking about, as they were heading into that meeting in the Oval Office with Zelensky and Trump, that they were saying there's going to be no territorial submissions, there will be security guarantees, there will be no limitation on the Ukrainian armed forces, and the war will continue on until we get a, quote, just and lasting peace, which means everything the way that Zelensky wants. That's what they said going in. So they got it. Because there is no, Russia's not going to agree to an unconditional 30-day guarantee, which the West knew, which is why they were pressing for that, because they knew if they set a condition like that the Russians would never meet, then they get their war continued on. And so that's what has happened here. So up to this point, Trump is not able to convince Zelensky to do anything different. He's not able to convince the European Union to do anything different, and he's not able to convince Russia to do anything different. The only thing that has changed is that now Trump has a revenue stream for America's defense industrial base. That's it. Otherwise, that question that the reporter asked there is pretty valid. How is this any different than what Biden was doing? Because that's what Biden did. And you recall all during the years of the Biden administration, if you were watching our channel back then, you noticed that was one of my biggest beefs. What is the strategy? Where is the benefit to American national security interest? How is this good for America? How will your actions accomplish your verbal goals, which is to end the war? And there was none. It was just words on a paper or a declaration made in front of a TV camera, when all the actions just said, what we're trying to do is continue the war. That's what they were trying to do, and that's exactly what they did. Whether that was their stated objective or it was mere incompetence, can't really say, but what I can tell you certainly, because we have graphic evidence to validate it, is that there was no actual strategy that had a chance of success, and so there was no success. And now here we are here. Now, Russia has continued on with they have not changed in any of their views either at any point during this war, and they continue on both in the air and on the ground. Now, Ukraine in recent days, as I mentioned at the top of this show, with the air campaign, has had some successes here, and now then they've also had some successes on the ground. I've already told you that that penetration that they had in the early part of August in the Pokrovsk area, a pretty big penetration, up to 18 kilometers, nearly 20 kilometers in some places, was checked by the Ukrainian side. They sent the Azov Corps over, sent several brigades, and they checked it. Russia is continuing to try to move, but they haven't been able to do much. They've been nibbling around the edges. They had some movement to the right of that a little bit. In another pocket that was formed, Ukraine has since even pushed some of that back, and they're kind of holding the line there. So that part is kind of stabilized. Well, now here in just the last 24 hours or so, Ukraine has been moving in another area, because we also talked about there was an advance in the Kupiansk area. And so now then you see on this battle map here that the Russians had moved into a semicircle around the city a week or so ago. They have not been able to advance any further than that. And now then Ukraine has once again launched a local counterattack, and they are making some pretty big inroads in that penetration. You see this going from the north to the south around there. So now then they're making that whole penetration untenable for the Russian side. The question is going to be now, tactically, can the Ukrainian side, do they have enough punching power to get through that and to chop it all the way off and to reestablish what it was before this penetration? Or can Russia send more reinforcements of their own to prevent that and possibly even expand it? Unknown what that's going to do, but that's what's happening right now. So Russia made a move, but they were unable to exploit it. And now the Ukraine has launched a counterattack that could push it back to where it was before the thing started. Now, when you add in also the deep strikes that's going on with the oil limitations on the refining capabilities, that's putting some pain on the Russian side. It's hurting. And there's no question that it is. And you see that Russia says it puts out its fire a large oil refinery in the latest drone attack. And this is part of a stepped up drone attacks that has been having some success. But as I said earlier, that is what is the case right now. There's every reason to expect that, just like every other phase in this war, when one side or the other starts to get some success, the other side will figure out a way to limit that damage and will then have some counterattack. You saw that's what literally is happening on the ground right now, this time on the Ukraine side, moving through there. All of this has led Zelensky to be a lot more cocky, and believe me, that is saying a lot. But if there was any thought that he would be willing and in a position to start submitting to the to what Trump wants to do, to give away the territory, what the Russians want him to do, you can forget about that now. This is in a comment that he is making on X. I think this was just this morning. He says the only way to open a window of opportunity for diplomacy is through tough measures against all those bankrolling the Russian army and effective sanctions against Moscow itself, banking and energy sections. This war won't stop with the political statements alone. Real steps are needed. We expect action from the U.S., Europe, and the entire world. So you may recall that the absolute best time for Ukraine ever to have achieved a negotiated settlement that would have been to benefit of Kiev, and when Russia was at its weakest, was in November of 2022. The Ukraine side had just taken a huge swath of Kharkiv Oblast and driven the Russians out of there. They had forced the Russians out in the Kherson area, out of Kherson City. They actually had possession of it. They willingly gave it up, moved back across the Dnipro River, blew the bridges, etc. And so they were in a, not a free fall, but they were on a significant retrenchment at that time. And that's at the same time Russia did a forced mobilization of 300,000 people. That was just at the beginning. They still were, some of them were being thrown from the recruiting or the mobilization crew within a couple of weeks right into the front line, barely even, trained up. Some of them, they didn't even have equipment because Russia was not prepared for that. So they didn't even have the equipment and stuff necessary to properly kit out these troops, and many of them there were in ill-fitting uniforms and inadequate kit, etc. But that's what they had to do. So at that moment, Russia was the most vulnerable they had been at any point during the war, either before that time or afterward. And you had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, openly claimed this is a really good time to have some negotiated settlement, because he saw that the Russians were frantically building defensive lines in the eastern part of the country. He knew the capabilities that Russia had on defenses, and he knew that they were going to do what they could to buy time to build up their defense industrial base, to get their troops trained, to get more either mobilized or recruited, etc. But he knew that was going to take time. Turned out that it was well over a year is how much time it was going to take. At that moment, Ukraine could have said, all right, this is as good as it's going to get. We can now get some pretty decent terms, maybe better than what they had earlier that year in the Istanbul, the famous one that we got rid of and failed to take advantage of at that time. That also would have been relatively good for the Ukraine side, but they might have been able to get better because they actually had some leverage. But instead, buoyed by success, according to what we've known since, the Biden administration was not exactly, they were actually a little upset at the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for even saying that out loud. But then Zelensky was like, oh, hell no, because they said, look, we just pushed them out of Kherson. We routed them and shoved them all the way back past the Old School River in the east in the Kharkiv area. Oh, hell no. I want to keep going. I want to win. I want to drive them out of the country. So he got buoyed by the success, and it was legit, no kidding success. Biggest successes of the war on the ground for Ukraine. Not minor. But even at that time, the fundamentals that go into national war-making capability and wars of attrition were unquestionably on the Russian side. The wisest thing they could have done on the Ukraine and Western side was to recognize those realities, which it appears Milley did, and then seek to have a negotiated settlement, because then you could have had, not only could you have saved a lot more territory, saved a lot of men that are now dead. It could be likely in the many hundreds of thousands are dead today that wouldn't have been if they'd have taken the wise decision then taking an appetite spread. And I know you want all the way. I know you see some success here, but the fundamentals say you're not going to get there. But Zelensky was unwilling to see any of the rational stuff. He just saw what happened on the ground and just extrapolated that forwards. We're going to hear, we'll keep doing it. You guys give me a bunch of stuff. Give me all kinds of equipment sets, tanks, artillery pieces, drones, missiles, all this kind of stuff, air defense stuff. Yeah, give me all that. And then in 2023, we'll go on an offensive and continue on with what was going to happen here. That's what he wanted to do. But the fundamentals were in a place at that time that would have mitigated against that. A sane, unemotional analysis would have said this is disaster. And I wrote that. I did write that in the months before that happened. I said, no, this is not going to go well for very practical reasons. The same thing I'm sure that General Milley saw, but they weren't willing to. Now here we are in a situation that's not even that far in the Ukraine's favor, because they have this success with the drones on Russia's oil refinement capacity. They've been having this in the past month or so. And then now here they have stopped Russian penetrations in Prosk and now another one in Kupiansk and could roll those back. But at the same time, Russia is also virtually everywhere else along the front line still nibbling forward. They have taken territory in small chunks in almost every other area all the way through. I think Sumy is the one other area where Ukraine has had some success on one of the flanks and pushing Russia back a little bit. But the fundamentals of an attrition war remain decisively in Russia's favor, far more so now than in November of 2022. And a sober look would say, okay, we've had some success here. This is about as good as we're going to now, not as good as November 23 by a mile. So let's do something now to end this. But instead, it sounds like Zelensky is even more buoyed, just like he was in the end of 2022. And now he sees some success and he's like, yay, let's just keep going. Let's just mentally just drag this out forward, and we're going to continue to have success. And one of these days we'll knock all the Russian oil off the balance, and then they'll be forced to come. That's not going to happen, because Russia has a lot of other cards they haven't played. Don't forget about the Oreshnik. If things start going south, if that starts, continuing on, and Russia for some reason can't stop the drone attacks on their oil infrastructure and starts trickling up from 21, 22, 23, 24, 25%, maybe getting close to 30. I promise you, they're not going to let it get to a critical place without amping up what they're doing and bringing heavier firepower, and maybe not 600 or 700 drones in a day, but 900 or 1,000 in a day. And they'll change their target set. And at some point, they have those Oreshniks, which virtually nothing can stop and from which you can't hide. And they can go after higher value targets on the Ukraine side. Believe me, it can get a lot worse from the Russian side. They have been following what appears to me to be a very risk-averse operation in use of their troops and their firepower, et cetera. And it has caused a slower move forward, which gives motivation to the Western and Ukraine side to think, well, they're not going that far. I showed you Macron about 2 weeks ago, who was mocking Russia, saying they'd only taken 1% of territory in a period, I think, from early 2023 forward. So they said, yeah, see, you haven't done anything like that, oblivious to the human cost that the Russians have inflicted upon the Ukraine side. But be that as it may, they're just looking at one aspect of this. And by going slow, Russians continue to give the ability of people to only see the territory and to stay motivated to keep trying these kind of things. But eventually, battlefield math will weigh out. In the world where there is spin and there is wishful thinking, and then there is the hardcore reality on the battlefield, it's going to play out the way the numbers indicate. It's going to play out the way the fundamentals indicate it will. And unfortunately, that's going to mean that I don't see any evidence that either the White House, Kiev, Brussels, London, Paris, Berlin, etc. I don't see any evidence that any of them are thinking the way that I'm talking about here. In fact, I think that they're thinking, yeah, we can just keep on going this way for a long time, years, 4.4 years to be specific on one of the British analysis that they said. And I think a lot of them are counting on that. They could care less how many Ukraine people die in the middle. But if it takes another 4.5 years of fighting and continuing to bleed on the Russian side, they're cool with that. Now, I don't think that it'll last that long, because that that ignores, that whole calculation ignores the Ukraine side of this, that they can last another 4.5 years. I doubt very seriously that will be the case. But whatever the number is, because as I'm talking about, there's the issue that an army can break and collapse suddenly when it gets too thin, or it can just keep going until it's ground to literally nothing. And you never know which way it's going to be. And World War II had examples of both. You had the British French army, who were acknowledged as the best militaries on the continent at the time, completely fell apart within weeks and collapsed when the Wehrmacht, the German army, had a breakthrough in a place they didn't expect, got into the rear, and was just literally driving through the countryside, and the whole thing just collapsed. And, the British fled at Dunkirk, and the French army basically surrendered in mass. But on the other side, you had the Wehrmacht itself, the German army, even when it was clear that all of the fundamentals that led to winning success in war were against them. And then they had the two-front war with the Allies in the West and the Soviet Union in the East, and they were just, slowly grinding down. The German army never stopped fighting, even when they had, old men and boys and all this stuff filling out the ranks because they had lost so many. They never stopped fighting, all the way until it literally was ground to dust at the very headquarters of Hitler in Berlin. That could happen again here. But one of those two things is almost certainly going to happen, barring some kind of miraculous, unimaginable thing happening in Russia itself. And I just don't see any possibility of that. I don't see not even evidence of anything like that. If anything, I think that the Russians are alarmed at what's going on at some of these places, but I expect them, like they have done throughout this whole war, to take preventive and fixing action to change the dynamics and do something different. So we'll see how that works out in the coming days here. But the bottom line is, folks, the peace process is dead. Everything that's been happening from the time Trump came into office until this hour is dead. It's over, because no one in the Trump administration has any more of an idea how to get this over with than the Biden administration before. And it doesn't even look like they have that much of an interest to do so. And we, of course, know that the Kiev and the European side, they never wanted it over. So they've got what they want. And that is to thwart what Trump was doing. And they effectively have done that. So we'll see how it's going to work out. And as changes continue to happen, either in the air or on the ground, we'll continue to bring it to you so you're aware of what's happening right now, because we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you all of the truth, no matter what it is, so that you can make sense of the world around you. Thanks very much, folks. Appreciate it. Hope you have a good weekend, and we'll see you Monday morning on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.